Chapter 4. In civilian clothes, following carefully the instructions I had received, I walked slowly past the shop. The window was crammed with carpets of various sizes, shapes and hues, mainly from the Middle East. I turned round, walked back, and drifted in through the door out of the sun, attempting to adjust my eyes to the dark of the back of the shop, where I could see a staircase rising and disappearing through the ceiling. Avoiding the shop assistant, I moved through to the stairs, climbed them, and at the top walked along a few yards of a dimly lit passage to an iron grille gate which barred the way, wall to wall and floor to ceiling. I gave the password. The gate swung back and admitted me to a few modest offices, the largest of which was to be my classroom for a week. This was Special Branch HQ. There were 5 of us on the course. From such specialist experts as LSB Leakey, we learned about the culture, thought and behaviour characteristics of the Kikuyu. I remember in particular being taught about the Kikuyu use of the lying interrogative. If a Kikuyu was uncertain of the reason for a question, one should expect the immediate answer to be a direct contradiction to the facts. In other words, you show me the reason for the question, then I will consider giving you an honest answer. We were taught where to look for hidden articles in African huts, how to identify the ringleaders in a crowd. We were instructed on the format to use for special branch reports. It was now January 1954, 2 years since my arrival in Mombasa, and I was 24 years old. The course finished, I set off in my van to Thomson's Falls. Thomson's Falls, abbreviated by most to T Falls, is 120 miles from Nairobi, in the Laikipia district, which I was to be closely associated with for 8 years. The route from Nairobi to T Falls followed the road down into the Rift Valley. Then it was back on home ground, Naivasha. I saw the one half of the experimental station on the left-hand side, down towards the lake. Then I was past the Bell Hotel, and on the right I could see the rest of the station where I had lived. Another 10 miles to Gilgil, with its army camp and prison, and then turning right off the tarmac, I had another 50 miles on the Murrum Road, climbing past Old Kalu of Happy Valley fame, Old Jura Rock, to T Falls located at 7,700 feet. T Falls was a settler community, both Brits and Afrikaners, with a U-shaped township of 3 streets. The shops included one large Indian-owned grocer, Kasuku, and a Scottish butcher, Dykes. Services included a garage, Engelbrecht, post office, bank, Barclays, KFA branch, Kenya Farmers Association, a farmers' cooperative. Also for Europeans only, there was the centre of all society activity, the club. This boasted polo pitches, tennis and squash courts, snooker room, table tennis table, and once a year a course for horse racing. While I was not one of them, not a settler, somehow I always felt comfortable, at home in T Falls with its farmer community and diversity of farms. Close by were quite small shambas concentrated on milking cattle and pyrethrum. Further afield, as the Murrum Road stretched away northwards in the haze and the dust, there came the cattle and sheep ranches, such as those at Rumaruti. There the ranchers lived lonely lives, at considerable distances from their neighbours, with enormous responsibilities for large numbers of livestock. All were now beset by the Mau Mau uprising, and in particular the emergency regulations, which were starting to affect them. Many had Kikuyu house servants, on whom suspicion would immediately fall. Could they trust them, or should they replace them? Some were family retainers of long standing. Would their loyalty withstand the tribal ties and the pressures to take bestial Mau Mau oaths requiring them to rise and kill their employers? In the months and years to come, farmers would resist the orders to send their Kikuyu employees to government camps. Some would pay dearly with death for their obstinacy. Others would survive with both physical and mental scars from panga attacks for all to see. The waterfalls were named after the explorer Joseph Thomson, 1858 to 1894. While no more than a few yards across at the top, they were 250 foot deep. Near their head was Barry's Hotel, where I settled in. The hotel consisted of a modest main building with sitting and dining rooms and a separate bar, which led out onto a lawn and the top of the falls. Guests' accommodation was a series of outhouses and cottages. Mine contained a bedroom and a large sitting room with open fire. The hotel generator provided electricity. The water was clean and hot, and the food was abundant. Before leaving Nairobi, I had sold my .32 automatic. It had been nice and unobtrusive in the shoulder holster I'd made for it, but it tended to jam. I bought a .455 Colt revolver. This was now in a holster on my thigh all the time. Being of an unusually large size, most revolvers were .38 or .45, the ammunition was expensive. I practiced only sparingly with it therefore, and discovered I was depressingly incompetent at hitting any target. Still, it looked impressive and, I reasoned, would discourage any Mau Mau suspects from trying anything on with me. I presented myself at the small office of the Coordinator of Emergency Activities, Brigadier, the Brig, Duke. A bachelor, he had been a senior-ranking general in the war, was imprisoned for some years by the Japanese, and now owned a small farm nearby. My work was to include liaison with the brig, the army, police and special branch staff, driving out in my van to collect suspects from various farms and bring them in for interrogation. Interrogations were conducted at tea falls, or more often out in the field on the old Kalu Valley. From the results of these interrogations, I learnt of the obscenity and depravity of the acts that were required to accompany Mau Mau oaths. Two examples were taking the testicles of a donkey, soaking them in the prostitute's period blood and eating them, copulating with a bitch dog while striking her head with a rungu so that she was killed by the 7th stroke. Whatever its exotic part in European folklore, the old Kalu Valley now consisted of hard-working, alarmed farmers of British, Italian, German, Israeli and Afrikaans descent. Men and women, they were all holstered with sidearms. At night, windows and doors were secured as far as possible. Sidearms were taken to the bath and toilet. Hundreds of Kikuyu labourers and house staff had been moved out, but the farms had to continue to operate. So Kikuyu were retained, much to the brig's frustration, because of their continuing security risk. There were furious arguments between the brig staff and European farmers and farm managers concerning the numbers of Kikuyu still employed by them. An early unpleasant experience during this period was going down to the bottom of the old Kalu Valley where it met the forest. From this forest, a Mau Mau gang had slipped out and attacked a herd of Frisian cattle. Between the time that the alarm was raised and any relief could arrive, the cattle had been slashed and mutilated with pangas and simmies. Their hamstrings had been cut, vulvas stabbed. I saw what seemed to be an endless stream of innocent animals lying down in submission to their wounds, or trying to walk on their front legs. They all had to be shot. How to offer protection to European women on their farms was a continuing problem. There was the lady and her teenage daughter who lived several miles out of Tea Falls, right against the Aberdares forest. There was Joycey Dickinson, twice widowed, a willowy socialite with a loud upper-crust voice, who lived on a small farm against the Marmonet forest. In her 40s, Joycey was a real character, the equivalent of the English village busybody. Some days of each week she lived in Tea Falls, where she worked for the brig in his HQ office. She told me one day of a nasty experience. She was driving her station wagon off her farm when an African rushed across the road in front of her, brandishing a panga. She stopped, drew her automatic, and fired after him. "Gosh, I was scared to death I might hit him," she whispered. March starts the rainy season in Kenya. This year the T-Falls Afrikaners decided it would be the year, despite the emergency, to show the rest of Kenya, particularly the Roineks, how to play rugby. From their farms and ranches they drove into the Van Riebeek School, erected rugby goalposts, nominated a coach, Jack van der Westhuizen, and started practicing and drawing up a match list. I went along to find I was the only pure Roinek there. I was put to play inside centre outside the fly half Alf McIntyre, ex-Stellenbosch University wing 3/4. Alf's father was said to have been a professional sprinter in the north of England, and his mother Sal was an Afrikaner, a Van der Venter. Their progeny was an accomplished, fast and flashy rugby-playing son. Our first match was against NAC, on paper a far stronger side. We played in a rainstorm umpired by Bruce Mackenzie, ex-South Africa, a farmer who was later to become Minister of Agriculture in independent Kenya. T4 colours were dark blue, NAC was black. Yet despite this, throughout the rain I was amazed to experience a high quality of refereeing. I was really keyed up. My last serious rugby had been a few days in Rhodesia, and prior to that, 3 years earlier, for London County schoolboys. Wing forward was my true position, but okay, I could tackle. With Alf doing his flashy stuff and then making long touch kicks, we used the ball quite well, and there was no score at half-time. Halfway through the second half, NAC's star centre George Simpson came bursting through from broken play. Just as he went to put the ball down for a try, I crash-tackled him. The ball went loose and I touched it down. Phil was standing as an NAC reserve next to the NAC coach, in the crowd watching the match. "Hell, that was a good tackle," remarked the coach. The match rampaged in the unrelenting rain from one end of the pitch to the other, until, a few minutes from time, there was a loose scrum a few yards from the NAC line. I moved forward. The ball squirted out from the side of the scrum. I had it in my hands, and nobody was going to stop me. "Christ, that is a good player. Where has he come from?" "That's my friend, who you said last year was no bloody good," answered Phil. The only match T4s lost that season was against Kitale, when Alf couldn't play, and I deputised as fly half. Open side flanker for Kitale that afternoon was Eddie Evans, ex-Bath and later captain of East Africa of 15. He gave me an uncomfortable time. I claimed to myself and to others that the referee was letting him stray offside, but on reflection came to the conclusion that it was probably just Eddie's speed and excellent timing on the break. And so the T4's team went round Kenya having a totally successful season. The enthusiasm and dedication of the Afrikaners was a revelation to me. They worked so hard in the scrum without any dirty play. Opposition scrums just crumbled before them. Occasionally the ball came back when Alf would do his showy stuff in front of his family and female admirers. Once in a while I got the ball, and a couple of times I scored. For the T4's Afrikaners, this rugby was just about the height of excitement. Most of them did not belong to the T4's club. They felt uncomfortable with the British and, because of their religious convictions, were not very keen on alcohol. This meant that post-match celebrations were quite muted, despite the excitement and enthusiasm for the game, universal in both sexes of all ages. Alf and I became friends, and I used to visit his family farm north of T4's when he was there, with his attractive sister Lucy. One day, going to the farm in my van, I lost control on a corner on the dry road and skidded front on into a thorn sapling, which did not do my radiator any good. The van limped into the farm where Alf plugged the leak and showed me why my driving technique had caused the accident. You must get your foot off the brake the moment you get into a skid, Aussie. The instinctive reaction is to press hard on the brake, but you must resist it, get your foot off the brake, and then you have a chance to retain steering control. It was advice which, years later, I was to remember. It saved my life. Politically, the Kenya settlers were getting restless. As they saw it, the Europeans were divided into three categories. 1. The true whites of the country who had committed themselves to it, who had often suffered considerable privations for it, who loved it and planned to stay there forever, the settlers. 2. The British government officers who had no commitment but who administered the country, from the governor down through PCs, DCs, etc., police and customs officers, agricultural and veterinary departments to the Public Works Department, PWD. 3. An increasing number of commercial parasites who had even less commitment to the country. They worked for large organisations like Dalgety, Smith, Mackenzie, Cooper Motors and breweries. And yet, despite the fact that the settlers were the ones who were truly committed, they had little influence over the future of their country. They were in the hands of UK, mother country to most of them. The rumbles of discontent reached Special Branch, and I was called into the office of the local Special Branch officer. "I want you to assess the mood of the settlers here," he said, "with particular reference to the rumour that, if the worst comes to the worst, some are planning a scorched earth policy of spraying arsenic, readily available as cattle deck for tick control, over their farms if they have to leave them. This would have made farms virtually unusable for years. So I started a process of infiltrating discussions at the club, in the KFA, etc., listening to the opinion of farmers, probing, trying to sift alcoholic bombast from real belief and intention. Most settlers believed it would be another 50 years or more before the Africans would be capable of running Kenya. They stated that no African would want to work for another African. The Asians they considered to be just traders of no real consequence to the country. The sales of arsenic dip were showing no significant rise, and in any event, it seemed to me that enormous quantities would need to be manufactured and distributed to meet the rumours. I submitted my report in some mental discomfort. I felt I had been less than truthful with these people, who I was increasingly coming to understand and consider as my friends. I had been deceiving them, drawing from them their confidences, because they knew I was Kenya Regiment and therefore, in a sense, one of them. The Special Branch officer was very pleased with the report, so much so that he was authorised by his superiors in Nairobi to ask me whether I would like a full-time career in Special Branch. Looked at positively, I had been helping the settlers by getting their views into the report, and at the same time quashing the rumour that they were seriously considering a scorched earth policy. However, my ambition was to be a farmer. I had set my sights on this 6 years ago when I left school. I declined the invitation. It seemed to me that somehow Kenya expanded the characteristics, good and bad, of its Europeans. There was no way anyone could hide his or her background and antecedents for long. And what would be the point? There were so few Europeans that one had to learn to get on with people of all kinds. Entertainment was so limited that drinking was an accepted occupation, together with outdoor sports. The only social activities were a film show at the club at the weekend, card play, usually bridge, and sometimes poker. All the Tea Falls British men had been in the war and, as visiting Nairobi contract bridge teams discovered to their cost, some had honed their bridge-playing skills during years as POWs. They had been encouraged by the British government to settle in the Kenya highlands on special land price terms, and they did not see why their home government should now apparently be turning against them. What had they done to deserve this? Had not the highlands been virtually deserted when they settled here? Had they not imported cattle and developed herds, grown pasture where none grew before, grown maize, cereals and other crops where none grew before, given employment to Africans? Did not many farms have schools on them for the children of employees, all funded by the farm owners? Had they not been fair to their employees, I asked? Were there not law courts in every town to see that all received justice under the law? All right, some settlers were boozers, some were idle. The odd homo had his favourite African boy, but that was nothing new. Was not this typical of any Western society? If there had been concerts to go to, they would have flocked to them. There was a dramatic society in Tea Falls, and all British and many Afrikaans families went to their productions. I was standing alone, my back to the open fire in the Barry's Hotel lounge, John Collins in hand. I had recently discovered the pleasures of the John Collins. My eyes focused on a not attractive, impatient-looking girl in her mid-30s who had moved through the doorway. Having got her drink, and replenished my own, of course, I started investigating. She explained she was an Australian reporter who had been sent by her magazine to write a story on Davo. She was returning home the next day without the story. "It's ridiculous, the tales he tells. I don't believe a word of them, and nor would my readers," she said. "Look, I've been in action with Davo," I protested. "I've seen first-hand his incredible speed and silence as he moves through the bush. He's a real professional. He doesn't drink, smoke, or swear." "Oh, big deal," she said. "It certainly must help," I said. "He has a personal record already of killing 34 Mau Mau, and he's over 50 years old, you know. I mean, you have to agree. When you look at his history, it's pretty interesting." "Yeah, well, I got some of it," she said. "Born in Scotland, family emigrated to Aussieland, where they went bankrupt." I interrupted. "So then in his teens he worked his way to the Americas, where he killed a man in Mexico and fled to the USA." "Yeah, and this is where it all gets unbelievable. The story of Wyatt Earp befriending him and teaching him all his 6-gun shooting and gun tricks, etc." "Well, he can demonstrate these tricks to this day." "Yeah? Well, I can understand your skepticism. It's just that he can back up his talk with incredible action. I can't prove that he was indeed a G-man in Chicago, as he says, but I do know he was in the Cheshire Regiment, then in the Spanish Civil War, and finally the KAR. Currently he runs his informal anti-Mau Mau unit under the orders of the Kenya police." She was unimpressed. She had made up her mind. Shortly afterwards she made her apologies and retired to her room, leaving me to muse over her disbelief. So many people in this country seemed to be larger than life. They lived life to the full, outrageously others might think. For many, loneliness was the spur to this behaviour. There was so little variety in their leisure time, they tended to be hard, physical people who viewed British Reserve with suspicion. "Why can't the Brits just say what they mean instead of trotting out all this false modesty? They're so devious," I had heard them say. Many of the settlers were bachelors. There were very few unmarried European women, and to have an affair with an Asian or African girl would result in social banishment by the settler community. I had already seen the results of this problem firsthand. One of my Rhodesia comrades, brown-skinned, gives an impression of a touch of the tar, old boy, had fallen in love with and become engaged to a settler's daughter from Kitale. Her parents had thrown her out of the family. Mulling over my thoughts, I strolled to the outside bar for a last drink. Seated, playing poker, were 2 European men I'd never seen before. One was a tall, rangy, long-armed, well-muscled man. The other was of medium build, with fair hair. They introduced themselves as Dunn from Ireland and Priest from Denmark. Eventually I slid off my stool, wished them good night, and strolled across the cool starlit grass and up the short flight of stairs to my outside room and bed. How I loved the sound of that water, the falls. What a peaceful background they gave to rest and sleep. Without warning, through my half-sleep, I heard muffled, unmistakable plops. Off my bed in an instant, I tore into my clothes and went out into the night. The barman was running back and forth outside the manager's quarters, calling, "Buona, buona!" I rushed into the bar. Slumped over the card table was Priest. Lolling against the counter was Dunn, revolver in hand, hanging down by his leg. "All right, I shot him," he slurred. "He was cheating. Anyway, he pulled first." As the police arrived, I saw the Australian reporter, mouth agape, trying to collect her thoughts sufficiently to write something coherent in her notepad. Next day, the brig was holding a meeting in his office. Yes, well, Priest had some documents in his room. They were in Danish. I've sent for Muller's Danish wife to come and translate them for us. The brig was quite excited at what seemed to him to be a mystery that might have security implications. Nobody else seemed to follow his reasoning, but eventually the Danish lady arrived and scanned the documents. A smile came over her face. "They are demands for alimony from Denmark," she said. The prosecutor couldn't prove it was not self-defense. Priest was dead and couldn't witness. The barman said he had just closed the bar and was walking towards his room, so he hadn't seen the shooting. Dunn, a drifter of doubtful background and a very recent immigrant, was acquitted and deported. The Australian reporter went home as planned. Out of the blue, I received a summons to appear at court in Nairobi. I was charged with having damaged a police motorcycle. The police claimed that outside their offices in my van, I had reversed and knocked over a police motorcycle. I had then driven off. I looked at the back of the van. There was no sign of any damage. I drove the 120 miles down to Nairobi and duly appeared in court. My defense was that A, there was no sign of damage to my van. B, the police summons agreed that I had been properly parked before reversing. If the motorcycle had been knocked over where it had claimed, it was not properly parked. C, between the parking area and the main road was a distance of 60 yards covered by a 5-mile-an-hour speed limit. That was plenty of space for a policeman, if he had seen the alleged accident, to catch up with me. And D, in Nairobi, there was another Morris Cowley van of exactly the same colour and a close registration number. I put it to the magistrate that the police had not seen who had knocked over their cycle. I was being used as a scapegoat. I had important intelligence work to do in T-Falls. The case was dismissed. The police prosecutor winked at me as I left the court. Shortly after this, a British Army unit reported that their intelligence suggested that there were Mickeys living in a swamp on a large ranch outside Rumaruti. I went along as observer to the Army action. The plan was to mortar the swamp, including, unfortunately, whatever innocent wild animals might be there, as well as Mau Mau. The mortars were set up on a bluff which overlooked the swamp. A sighter was fired which landed in the swamp, as planned, so the order was given to carry on firing. After a time, human cries were heard, but they were not from the swamp. They were from the ranch labour camp on the far side of the swamp. Through the binoculars, women could be seen running around screaming. What the hell's going on? Well, we seem to have got some wrong charges, or they've been wrongly labelled. The wind hasn't changed. Well, for God's sake, stop firing! I was invited into the bungalow of one of the ranch managers and was surprised to discover how modest, indeed barren, it was. The only clue to the occupant's background was one photograph on a wall of his college year, long time back in the UK. How many of the labour force and their families had been injured, I asked. The answer I reported back to the brig. The embarrassed army unit and the brig then took over responsibility, thank goodness. Dear Ian, Ingrid came to see us a few days ago and was obviously pleased with herself and proud of the fact that she's got as far as the semi-finals of Miss Universe and has been interviewed on the wireless here. Valda is quite used to being on the wireless, of course. Perhaps you are best out of that relationship, although I do think that you should be finding yourself a wife and settling down. Valda and I are making do very well here, so don't worry. Love, Mum. Honey, I did enjoy my short stay with your mum and sister. I just wish I could have stayed longer. Now I'm back in Salisbury, I'm wondering if we should meet again. Could you send me some money for the flight? An army captain here is very keen on me, and I am uncertain what to do. I feel I want to come to Kenya, put my head on your shoulder, and stay there forever. Enclosed are some recent photos of me modelling hats. Hope you like them, Ingrid. And very stylish they were. I did like them a lot. Dear Ingrid, truth to tell, this Mau Mau business has hardened me. It is difficult to stay the same person. You may not like what you see. I don't have a lot of money just now, but I enclosed a single airfare with my love. I expect we can scrape together the return fare for you when you are here, I wrote. Honey, please don't let your experiences make you hard and unfeeling. I do want to see you again. Thank you for the money, she replied. I never saw Ingrid again. I sold the engagement ring for a few shillings, which I put in a Red Cross box. She wrote to me once more, informing me she was marrying the army captain, Builder something or other. February 1954 was not a good month. Hoppy Pearson, Sheila's elder brother, was out front as usual with his recce group. They were armed with Sten guns, light in weight, offering immediate automatic firepower. Behind him, one of his Askaris caught a magazine against a creeper, or a piece of bamboo or something. The whole lot went off. Hoppy collected much of it, one bullet tearing out his long appendix scar so that his stomach fell out. Apparently it was 3 days before he died. And Arthur, the great enthusiast, volunteered for the last time. He was a staff sergeant who should have been minding his own business, just keeping his base in order. He heard that a patrol was short of a senior NCO, so he volunteered. They were ambushed by some Mickeys who had precision weapons and knew how to use them. Trying to give orders and lead from the front at the same time, he raised himself up to look around and was shot straight through the head. Quisha. Those 6 months in Salisbury, full of jokes and laughs. The enthusiastic, baby-faced Lancashire lad, with qualifications that Kenya needed, and now he was dead. Fighting for what? So Arthur, who had slept on the left of me in Rhodesia, was dead. To my dejection, I now heard that Neil Purvis, who had slept on my right, and Francis, who had slept opposite me, had both been killed in action. They had died in separate actions, throwing grenades. Dangerous bloody things, grenades, I thought. I had always been nervous of grenades. When on patrol, I had soon found reason to leave mine behind in camp. I had enough to carry anyway, with the Bren and its magazines. There were now 5 dead out of our barrack room of 25. The brig was speaking to me. Osborn, Ian, I've been asked if there is anyone I could recommend to help set up a new intelligence unit in GHQ Nairobi. Your Swahili is good for someone who's only been in Kenya for 2 years. I know you like tea falls, and indeed you've been doing a good job for us here, but it could well be you would do an even more useful job down there. So if you have no strong objections, I plan to put your name forward. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. I have no objection. So in April 1954, I drove back down to quarters at the Kenya Regiment HQ and started work in the Central GHQ Intelligence Unit under Major Holmes, who I came to consider a sensible and able man. One day I overheard him warning new officers in his team that most Kenya Europeans, whatever their ranks, were well educated, similar to most British officers, and should be treated with respect. My personal experience of the result of this talk was when it was respectfully pointed out to me by the officer standing next to me that I was using a urinal reserved for officers.